She says it involves giving up those fantasies that attend our lives at an earlier stage and coming home to the way the world really is. In other words, each of these temptations suggests the fantasies that when we're children we wish the world were like, and what Jesus says yes to is the world as it actually exists. Think about it for a moment. That first temptation was to turn stones into bread. Has there ever been a child that hasn't wished that this was the kind of world in which all of your needs could be met without effort? That all you had to do was to wish for something and it would be so? That the governing principle of all reality would be, you want it, you get it? I remember as a little boy I used to play myself into exhaustion. And then I'd be overwhelmed by pangs of hunger, and I would have given anything if this were the kind of world in which I could have snapped my fingers and the flowers all around me had turned into chocolate chip cookies, or the rocks at my feet had turned into cinnamon rolls. I would have loved to have been able to simply express the wish for food, and there it would be magically. Or I remember when I got into my adolescence and went out for football. In high school, the coach would make us run around the track those first days of practice in August, and I would be so thirsty, and I can remember wishing it was the kind of world in which I could snap my fingers and a milkshake would materialize right before my face, or those cinders on the track would turn into ice cubes and I could stoop over and get some satisfaction from my thirst. Is there any child that hasn't wished at that stage that the world were different than it is? That all you had to do was wish, and behold, it came true. Well, look again at that second temptation. Jesus was taken up on the pinnacle of the temple and invited to jump off into midair and not worry about space and not give any thought to distance. He was being tempted to think of the world as a place where you simply, if you want to be one place this moment and another place in the next, all you have to do is snap your fingers. Again, I remember having this fantasy as a child. During my second grade, in Nashville, Tennessee, a heavy winter storm blew in from the time I went to school in the morning to the time school got out in the afternoon. In fact, I remember the temperature dropped to precipitous 40 degrees. Now, I wasn't used to wearing gloves because in Nashville it usually didn't get that cold. And I can remember the walk home that afternoon was excruciatingly painful. And at that moment, with every step, I wished it were the kind of world where I could have snapped my fingers and in 1 minute been in the warmth of the schoolhouse and the next moment been standing on my front door. In other words, I wanted to eliminate space and not have to struggle against it. Or that third temptation, where Jesus was taken up on a high mountain where he could see the glories and the wonders of the earth. And then he was told that if he would just simply lie down on his back, open his mouth, become totally passive, that all of this would be given him, all of the 10,000 things that make up this many-splendid world, it will all come to you without any effort whatsoever on your part. This temptation reminds us of the way it was where we begin our lives, in that paradise that we call the womb inside our mother's body. Stuart Emery says that it was a magnificent living arrangement, really. Here it was, you had security 24 hours a day, room service anytime you wanted it, temperature remains constant no matter what the season outside, everything provided, nothing asked of us or expected of us, no struggle, no effort, no pain. Now we don't remember that in cognitive specifics, and yet the subliminal memory of the way it used to be must linger on. And Ann Davis says that the great temptation that all of us face and that Jesus faced was thinking that the highest good lay somehow back there in the way it was or the way it is, that if we could just get back into that vaunted past and live there, this is the way life would be better. But Jesus, of course, said no to each one of those temptations. He refused to make nostalgia his stance of life. Nostalgia, remember, is the suspicion that God has somehow exhausted his creativity in the past. That way back there in some good old day, the creative one peeked out and everything since then has been downhill. Jesus never gave way to that nostalgic way of looking at reality, but rather he believed with all his soul what had happened to Abraham was in fact a vision of God. The Holy One had broken in and said to this man, I want to bless you, and the way I want to bless you is giving you things in the future that are better than anything you have right now or have ever had in the past. The God of Abraham broke in from out ahead. The God of Abraham spoke in terms of promise and not in terms of nostalgia. He suggested that the way to come to our fullest joy is not to stay with the way we were or the way we are, but to trust that the best is yet to be. That the future is where God is preparing for us the next stage of our fulfillment, and therefore we are to lean into that future. We are to faith it. We are to believe with all our hearts that eye hath not seen, ear has not heard, neither has it entered the imagination of humankind what the ingenious one has yet to give us in the future. In other words, Jesus realized that the way he liked it as a child, that existence where nothing was asked of him and everything was provided, was appropriate for then, but it did not represent his highest good. No, he recognized that having to work for his own bread, sowing and harvesting, having to walk down the steps of the pinnacle rather than just jumping off the temple, being involved himself in the creation of reality rather than just being a passive child, this was the way that the God of blessing intended to fulfill his purpose. And every one of us are caught every day between the temptation to want to go back into the good old days, to somehow feel like that the highest good lies behind us in some kind of nostalgia. How hard it is to believe that the best is yet to be, that the future out there that God is preparing is the place of our greater joy. The way it is going to be according to the biblical vision is always better than the way it is or the way it was. Gordon Cosby was asked one time to talk to the children of his church about what the Bible teaches us about life. He's a thoughtful interpreter. He took the assignment seriously. And when the moment came for him to stand up before these children, he made two basic assertions out of the biblical vision. He says the Bible teaches us, first of all, that life gets better and better as it goes along. It is better to be an infant than a fetus, better to be a child than an infant, better to be an adolescent than a child, better to be an adult than an adolescent. There is an opening out, an increasing of possibilities. Life gets better and better as it goes along. The Bible also teaches us, he says, that life gets harder and harder as it goes along. It is harder to be an infant than a fetus, harder to be a child than an infant, harder to be an adolescent than a child, harder to be an adult than an adolescent. In other words, the increased perplexities of life are there at the same time with the increased possibility. He said to the children, it's important that you keep the sequence that I have just suggested intact. If you begin with the notion that life gets harder and harder, that is, if you focus on the fact that the demands of life inevitably increase, that has a way of crushing you, discouraging you, and that's the temptation to want to go back when it was simpler and easier. But remember, he said, the first word is the word of hope. Life gets better and better as it goes along, and believing that is where we get the courage to cope with the increasing complexities. Now, I believe that this was Jesus' vision of life. I believe it was that out of which he made his decision there in the wilderness. And I think that every person who has believed that vision and dared to live out the fact that though it may not seem like it at the moment, the best is yet to be, those people have discovered in their own experience that Cosby was right. Life does get better and better, even though it also gets harder and harder. Week before last, we had lots of bereavement to occur in our church. And I found myself working with several different families as they were having to relinquish the way it used to be and live into a world without their loved ones, and I was trying to speak of this hope that so oftentimes is so difficult to feel. And I remembered something that had happened one September morning back in 1935. My mother came in that day and said, "You don't want to put on your play clothes because you're not going to the backyard the way you usually do. Today I want you to put on your best clothes. Today you start to school." I had not had the benefit of going to kindergarten and nursery school because back in those days that was not the pattern. And to be honest, I hadn't been very well prepared for this business called school, and so I remember having some very heavy feelings as I looked out the window at the swing and at the sand pile and at that fenced-in backyard where I'd spent so many carefree hours. There was something so appealing about that place where I had played without struggle and effort. And I didn't know what that word school stood for. In fact, when I went there, it was very dismaying and overwhelming. There were halls, there were classes, there were teachers, there were people. It was much more difficult than it had been to play in the backyard. And yet, when I lived into it, it turned out that school was far better in terms of my growth as a person than staying in the backyard could ever have been. My fulfillment would have been thwarted if I had stayed with the good old days and somehow not believed that the best is yet to be, even though our best in God's judgment is a demanding and complex reality. Therefore, I think the secret of Jesus coping with those temptations was his steadfast belief that God meets us out of the future and not out of the past, that though the good old days were magnificent in what they gave for us, God has good new days to give, and to trust that the flow of life is meant to go forward and not backward is to find the strength to withstand the temptation that all of us feel, and that is to collapse in the face of the present and the future and want to escape back into the past and live in the nostalgia that God exhausted his creativity long ago and the future is nothing but bleak. That is not so. St. Augustine used to say, you can tell by where your face is how God meant for you to live. If the past had been the place that the highest good was located, then our faces would have been on the back of our heads and we would have spent our whole lives looking back and remembering. But notice, friend, where your face is. It's in front. It is pointing toward the future. The best is not back yonder. The best is yet to be. Even at the grave we can say it. The best that God has to give us to bless is out there in the great not yet. It is not to be found in the already. And for every one of us who are tempted back to that existence where we had to make no effort and where everything was given to us, it was easier. But believe me, friends, it was not better. Therefore, bet your life on it. Stake your existence on the fact the future is where the highest and the best is yet to be found. God has put our faces on the front of our heads because he means for us to live in courageous anticipation, not in despairing nostalgia. Believe it. The best is yet to be. God always comes out of the future. What he wants to give us is better than anything he's given us in the past. And to believe it is to conquer our temptations too. Amen.